Hello, once again. Alright, so I just finished talking about the majors and the minor scales and some of the patterns with those. And the next one I want to talk about is the chromatic scale. First, let's talk about what an actual chromatic note is. The way I like to teach it is I compare it to natural notes, which are just your basic A, B, C, D, E, F, G notes. And then the chromatics are all the ones in between your sharps and your flats. A sharp, B flat, etc., etc. Um, Now, each of those depend on which scale and which key you're using. Key of, F has a B flat compared to the key of G, which has an F sharp. You get the idea. Some use sharps, some use flats, but enharmonically they are the same notes, which, if you have any questions about, we can talk about at a later date. But the idea of a chromatic scale is where you don't skip any notes. Every fret and every note is accounted for. Uh, the way chromatic scales are initially taught are as an exercise that you probably don't even realize that you're learning a type of scale. Earlier I've shown you the exercise for this simple 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that is very close to a chromatic scale, except it leaves out the open strings. Now, if you were to do this chromatic scale in open position, open strings, you would then go, and you essentially have 5 notes on that string. Alright, so you go E, F, F sharp, if we're coming from an F, F sharp, that's the way we're going to talk about it, G to G sharp. Now, after G sharp in the scale, you go back to A. Alright, then after A sharp, B, C, C sharp, next note D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B. Now this is a repeated note. That B is the same as your next string open. Alright, in the exercise it's okay to use as long as you understand and know that that note is repeated. So back to the B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. Now just like this E, 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 F, F sharp, G, G sharp. Now, you don't have to go that far, but it's good to know those notes. I typically like for students to start on a root, end on a root, therefore it sets up the entire framework of the scale, and then work your way back down. Now, as you may have noticed, not every note has a sharp. 2 notes, the B and the E, do not have sharps. They go directly to the next natural note. B to C, and E to F. Those are the instances where all of those happen. Now, what I typically do is have students sharps up, but then flats down. Now, same as before, if E does not have a sharp and it goes directly to F, that means F does not have a flat and it goes directly to E. So if you have F, E. Now, if we work our way backwards, E flat, D, D flat, C, B, because there is no C flat. Now the B, the repeated note, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C, C directly to B once again, B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, F directly to E. Now, everyone should know how to tune their guitar, EAD, GBE, and if you're doing this correctly, you can use that to double check yourself. Make sure you're ending up at the right spot at the right time. Now, if you do that open position chromatic scale, it's kind of easy because you use the open strings, you don't have to move your hand that much. But what if it goes beyond an exercise? What if you really want to use this knowledge somehow in a scale or a song? How do you apply this information? All right, now that's an E chromatic scale. All right, but what if you don't need an E chromatic scale? A lot of times, several types of scales, well, I'll save that for a minute. If you take this idea and you move it up, the way I like to talk about it is that you have two directions that your hand can go. You can go down and then approach into the scale, or you can play the scale and then move up out of position. For instance, if we are in A, all right, that's only 4 notes, but earlier I talked about having 5 notes per scale. All right, you have the option of here, sliding up out of position, or staying in position and coming back one and then coming back in. Because this right here, all right, that C sharp, same thing, repeated notes, all right? So you can either, I would like for you to work on this both ways, all right? So if you stay in position and slide in, you're going to have something that goes like this. Now the B string you do not have to slide into because of that repeated note we talked about earlier. You can just go straight over on the same fret. Then you slide back into the A. And so all right. It's the same idea as what you did down here in open position. You just have to take into account the open string and you slide back into position. Now, on the other way, instead of sliding into position, I talked about sliding up out of position. So, and then you would jump back to the 5th fret, slide up, jump back. Here you don't have to slide because of the B string. All right, start on A, end on A. Yeah, see how nothing's left out of the scale. Chromatic, all sharps, all flats, all the natural notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. All right, now that, as I hope you can see, is the same pattern here as here. Just a little, kind of fool around with how you want to actually approach it and use it. Whether it's slide into, if you want that kind of permutation where you're going into any of the chord tones, or you can slide out of it and then jump, whichever one you feel a little bit more comfortable with. Both correct answers because it's the same note used in different ways. Now, if a lot of times people use these scales, they will use them to actually move positions throughout the neck. Everything we stayed on position, we moved across. Now, when you're working with your pentatonic scales and you're just in one spot, one position, it gets kind of boring. You want to move up and down the neck, have a little bit more flair in what you're playing, a little bit more knowledge. So a lot of times when I do these chromatic scales, after a student understands the actual notes they're playing and the sharps and the flats and the naturals, how do you use them to move? All right, and the easiest way to do that is to shift across the neck going down 1 fret at a time, like so. There's my 4 notes. But instead of working and stretching for the 5th, you just slide down 1 fret, 1 string over. And the next one, same thing. As you can see, as I'm working up the scale, I'm moving down the neck. All right, now B string, you don't have to shift. The E string, you jump one more. Now you slide up 1 to get the octave of the root where you started. Now, as you can see, I went from the 9th position all the way down to the 5th position. And that helps me if I'm playing something, then moving, smoothly from position to position without awkward jumps, perhaps maybe in rhythm or time or just, something that's just doesn't sound as pleasing to the ear as it could. Now, another thing with that, I did as moving down the neck. That moves you through 2 octaves of the scale. If you don't want to maybe use that many notes, which we'll talk about in a minute, what if you just use 3 notes per string, and that allows you to move even greater distance? Now what you're going to do with that one, there's your 3 notes in a row, always in a row. That's the whole thing about chromatics. You don't skip anything. But what happens is, instead of jumping 1 fret down, you have to jump 2. See that? Now you're going to go from the 7th fret to the 5th fret. Yeah, and so forth and so forth. Now, because of the B string, you'll have to go 1 fret. See that? So now I've moved all the way from up here, all the way down, back down to my open position. Once again, using those chromatic scales to smoothly transition from one place to the next. Now, I mentioned, like, how is this useful in what you're actually going to be playing? The big thing about chromatic scales is that they're used in pieces. You don't sit there and you play like all of those notes one after another, or else it's just going to sound like an exercise. And you don't want your solos to sound like you're just ripping other people's riffs off, or playing some technical exercise that you spent 20 years on in your bedroom and you finally get to play it in front of people. You don't want to do that. Make it sound original in some way or another, and that's how these chromatic notes are used. The big scales that I can think of is like the Algerian scale, which uses a sharp 4, regular 5, and a flat 6 to give you this kind of Middle Eastern. You get this flat 3rd. Here's your sharp 4, 5, flat 6. There's your chromatic use in the scale. You know, and it gives you that kind of idea of a chromatic use in pieces instead of just all over the place. The big ones, blues scale has a flat 5. It's a pentatonic scale with a flat 5. So if you have a minor pentatonic, normally here's your regular 5, here's your flat 5, your chromatic note. It's octave. See how those, it's just as a passing tone, pretty much. And it's how you incorporate these chromatic notes, understanding where they fall within certain scales. You know, your bebop scales work the same way. You're dealing with like a major bebop is just pretty much a mixolydian scale with a minor 3rd in it. You know, if you're once again dealing with this, you get that movement out of it. So I actually think that was a minor bebop with a, you know, with a major 3rd added, but you get the idea. So hopefully this introduces you to the idea of what a chromatic note is and how it's actually used in what we're playing. You know, to recap, it helps you move smoothly from position to position instead of weird, awkward jumps, you know, where you're constantly having to look at your fingers instead of out at the audience. You don't want to do that. Plus, it just gives you a little bit more variety in some of your scales. All right? Well, hope it helps, and good luck.